Welcome back to Good Revenue. We're here today with Luke Cooper. He is a founder and an investor. And Luke, we're super excited to have you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
We have a ton of topics that we wanted to get in today, but what I thought we could do is really focus on your incredible track record, both as a founder, as well as your experience as you're now moving into a new phase in your career and life around being an investor. So with that in mind, we will jump in if that works for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know if I would say incredible just yet, but it's building.
I've heard some of the metrics, so I'll say it for you. You don't have to say it, but I think the audience will agree with me at the end. You really have had a remarkable journey. You grew up in poverty in Connecticut, and today you're a successful entrepreneur and investor. You are really inspiring a lot of people. I know I certainly felt a lot of appreciation meeting you and hearing a little bit about your story, which I'm hoping you'll share with us today. How has that unique experience shaped your perspective on both risk-taking and long-term value creation?
First and foremost, thanks again for having me on. I think an array of voices, archetypes are necessary to drive not only meaningful change, but a different perspective of what's available to you, both as a founder and as an investor as well. These perspectives are incredibly valuable and we just need more of them. So thank you for creating a platform that allows us to do that. I'm happy to be here. My journey has been a non-traditional, meandering one that began in Bridgeport, Connecticut, where I'm from. Most people think of Connecticut, they think of this happy place where you have white picket fences and dogs barking in the yard, but that's not representative of all of Connecticut. I was unfortunately given a beginning that really started with a father in prison. Even when I was born, he was in prison. He ultimately sentenced to 20 years and did 12 of those 20 as a result of the three strikes laws that were very prominent in the 1980s. And Bridgeport, Connecticut, especially, is a place where that is the norm. I didn't know professional people growing up because the only range of professions that I actually saw were lawyers that represented mostly criminal things happening in my community. But I was fortunate to have a lot of good people around me that had some visibility into what another life could be for me and for my sister, for my mom. And that's really the things that I stitched together to pull me from a place of poverty to like just thinking about the world and myself differently, right? Ta-Nehisi Coates, who's a famous Baltimore writer, talks a lot about these subjects. So I don't need to go into them with depth, but in some ways he's given me voice, right? Because he talks about the world between me and where I want to go and how disparate those worlds are. I was very fortunate. I went to a Jesuit prep school that again gave me visibility into a different kind of life and a different kind of existence that I yearned for as a young kid. Across that horizon of influences and experiences at prep school, I was able to meet some incredible people that gave me access and gave me friendship. And that friendship has meant everything in the world to me. I was very fortunate to get a basketball scholarship and play basketball in college. I always knew I wanted to be a lawyer. I read this book by Reginald Lewis called Why Should White Guys Have All the Fun? And that book was shocking to me for a number of reasons. It was not only exactly what I wanted to do in the world. I wanted to turn my law degree and finance proficiency on its head and really think about ways to build great companies, sell great companies, grow these modern organizations into behemoths, all the things that Reginald Lewis was doing. But it was also striking because the book was so bold, right? For him to say that in the title was just incredible and felt like it gave me license to think really big and to say things that oftentimes might not be what mainstream America wants me to say or expects me to say, but are the truth and resonate with my community in a way that tells their story as part of my own. And so that book was very special to me and really gave me a model for how to think about where I wanted to take my career. I got into Syracuse Law School. I was very fortunate 2 years ago to be the commencement speaker at the law school graduation. It was a surreal experience, particularly given the fact that I could barely afford to go to school there, particularly given the fact that when I went to school there, both at Syracuse and undergrad, my father was in prison. It was something that I hid from a lot of my friends and certainly faculty, anybody else. It was an incredible source of shame, but I think that's okay. Like, you got to face that shame on some level, right? Founders today, I tell them to go into customer discovery endeavors to go understand exactly how their customers are thinking about their prospective products, how they're thinking about their markets, what new insights they can garner from people that they don't know, who can give them objective feedback about the thing that they're working on. And sometimes there's a lot of embarrassment, shame, hesitation, reluctance to do exactly that. And I think my career, having had to do that at so many moments in life, was giving me the chops to be that kind of founder, to walk up to people and say the things that are going to give me the most objective, sharp feedback to drive the acceleration to the things that are the right things to build.
There's so much in that. And I really appreciate you sharing. It's an incredible story. And I think that you're certainly not alone. I think we all have things we feel shame about. And it's a very difficult emotion for everyone. I particularly really like the work of Brene Brown on that topic. I think it's really amazing and transformative, including in business settings. We don't talk about emotions and feelings enough here in this land, but with that perspective and that context, how do you think that affected how you look at risk and when to take risk? Because I think one of the things about entrepreneurship that we don't talk about enough in the United States is that there is quite a safety net for a lot of the people that are entrepreneurs. Like some of the biggest and brightest, from Bill Gates to Mark Zuckerberg, came from very affluent, comfortable backgrounds. And they're men and they're Caucasian. And those are positions of power in our society. And so how do you see risk when maybe nothing ever felt stable?
Yeah, it's a great question. One I think about quite a bit. And I think certainly in tech, one of our endeavors is very similar to Einstein, right? How do we say all the great things that we know about the universe in the smallest possible formula? E equals MC squared. In coding, it's the same kind of thing. Anybody can type this very long syntax about a command that then does something with an application. But how do you compress that to the very smallest amount of space so that you can type more faster, right? And so when I think about that, what comes to mind is this song, this line by formerly one of my favorite rappers, Meek Mill. We don't fear shit because we've been shit. And forgive my language. The statement was so provocative and relatable to me because it described my upbringing and my mentality. When you come from environments like Bridgeport, Baltimore, Detroit, North Tulsa, these places are riddled with violence and criminality. Oftentimes you don't have anything. You're just another member of the community that is stuck in the mud like everybody else. You're accustomed to not having things. You're accustomed to being born without a measure of success and confidence that your life is going to be great. Like you just adapt the philosophy that I don't have anything anyway. So what's the risk of me losing anything? And so when I think about my earliest endeavors in tech, building companies, I never really thought about what it would be like to lose because I always felt my name didn't have any meaning when I was born. I didn't have any material assets or wealth throughout most of my early life. And so I know what it's like to have nothing. And so why would I fear failing? Some environments, people, tend to think about startups as like a game, right? And it's not a real career. And so there's a lot of people when I first started who said, well, you're going to give up the practice of law to go build a startup. I was an M&A lawyer in my mid-20s that worked on already $250 million of transactions. I could have taken my career any direction I wanted to, but I chose to go back and get my MBA at Babson and build these great companies today, many of which are doing incredible things.
What was it about building something new then that attracted you?
It's the addition of something where there was nothing, right? If we're talking about growing up in poverty and like how that relates to the skill necessary to be a great founder, I think when you're growing up in poverty, there's nothing there. The world doesn't work for you in so many different ways. And so it pushes you into this place of deep ideation, creativity. You're constantly thinking of ways to get the things without tripping some other line, right? Because for most of the folks in the communities where I come from, the way that they're going to make that decision sometimes is doing something immoral or illegal. That's usually the only options that you have to pursuing something that doesn't exist, or food or whatever the thing is. You become more creative in how you think about bringing those things into reality. It was nothing for me at the start of my journey to go down this ideation path when I began to think about what I wanted to create with Fixed. And that journey really began from a place of loss. I didn't know what I was going to build. I built the wrong thing initially in 2013. I expended a bunch of capital that was misplaced. essentially wasted about 40 or 50,000, which was like everything back then. And the following year, I was sitting on a bus in Boulder during an accelerator program, not knowing what I was going to build next. And I saw these people around me gasp for air when I dropped my phone by accident. That just led me to this ideation and this conversation I started having with regular people on the bus about what they saw and why they reacted that way. As I began talking to them, the ideation journey I went on was, well, what if someone handed me a new phone when I got off the bus? It was a complete moment of like creative combustion, just thinking about all these possible scenarios that could exist. And also the frame of mind or the presence of mind to begin asking people about these crazy ideations, right? And that's the trick of entrepreneurship. It's great to think big and have these like amazing ambitions for how you want to see the world evolve once you've created a thing that matters enough that people buy it and keep buying it. But without moving from that place of ideation and dreamy thoughtfulness, you're never going to build anything, right? You've got to be able to move from that place to a place of courage and just ask the right question or ask people how they think about it or build the very small minimum viable thing and then get some more feedback about that thing. So those two things in building a company go together and they're almost inseparable. But I think a lot of those things come from my experiences, both as an entrepreneur, lawyer, and just growing up without resources.
Imagination and execution. I think that's exactly right for what you're saying. And also, I love that you took that unexpected inspiration and really ran with it. Your first company in the cybersecurity space resulted in a 27x outcome when you sold it. What were a couple of the key decisions that you made along the way that you think were really pivotal to that outcome?
I think it was a great experience. One of the things that was pivotal to that experience was my ability and fearlessness around growth, personal, individual growth. And I'll tell you what I mean, Neeta. I think oftentimes, and you especially see this with women, right? It's an unfortunate reality of the biases that exist and how those biases impact us as human beings. There might be a job opportunity that's hanging out there. It has 6 qualifications that you need to be considered seriously for the role. And the study that dug into this phenomenon discovered that oftentimes, and you might know this one, Neeta, that oftentimes women say, I only have 4 of those qualifications, so I'm not going to apply. Meanwhile, some dude from wherever he's from has 2 of those qualifications. He's like, hell with it. I'm going to apply.
I should be the CEO, obviously.
That's exactly right. So some of the augmentation that has to take place in us as entrepreneurs, as human beings, is really evolving our minds to more growth mindset and like thinking about ourselves as like capable of doing anything. One of the best parts of law school was not just learning legal theory and these conceptual frameworks that help me understand our systems of justice, our systems of economic freedoms and civic rights and civil rights, but also how to think and how to understand a thing, not go from a place of not knowing anything about a thing to then consuming large amounts of information, summarizing it into your brain, and then understanding the application of that thing to whatever it is that you're doing. And so law school was really good for that. But I think it's a skill that most of us can develop in ourselves without law school, and one that I think intuitively as humans we have. So for me, I was presented with the opportunity way back in the mid 2000s with a group of friends who were building the cybersecurity application. And I was just coming out of the practice of law. This is in a 2007, 2008 timeframe. And I'm coming out of the practice of law. I didn't have a business degree. I hadn't gone to Babson to get my MBA just yet. And so I didn't have a traditional business background, certainly not to the place where I should have had a tremendous level of confidence that I can go in and help build and grow and sell this company. There was really no reason for me to believe that. But I believed in my ability to quickly learn, understand, and assess where the opportunity was for this company and to go execute on our founding team's vision, which was to exit the business to a large scale acquirer. I jumped in and I just began to learn. I accelerated my understanding of the company, our markets, how we were going to execute on the growth plan, some of the barriers, how people thought about us. All of those things were things that I was just like learning in an accelerated fashion, all while building the right relationships that ultimately led to the exit. As I was doing that, getting an understanding in real time from those partners and prospective acquirers of how they thought about the company, what objections they had, feeding that back to management so that we could in real time evolve the company and get past those objections, still engaging these prospective partners and ultimately buyers to show them how we were evolving and building the company and addressing those objections, all to a place that led us to essentially a two-part transaction where we sold essentially 80% of the company for $3.5 million and all the rest in a combined transaction for about $60 million. There's a level of courage to have a belief in yourself that you can get there. And I try to leave all founders with that, Neeta, that you can get there. Don't just say, hey, I'm not product minded. I'm not a CTO. I don't have CTO's chop. You've got to understand that part of the business enough to make sure that your CTO is making good decisions and that it aligns with the customer philosophy that you've put in front of your market as the reason why they should buy your product. And so those are like critical steps, I think, in terms of understanding that. And I think the other piece of it is really believing in yourself without question, and then allowing for creativity to flourish. Because a lot of times we look at things and say, I don't know a thing. I've now learned a thing and I'm just going to do it that way. If you do it that way, you're going to produce the more traditional yields. And that's not the business I'm in. I'm in the business of these orthogonal outcomes that lead to outsized returns because you've unlocked that value by connecting this and this in a way that other people just haven't. When I began to think about the business from that perspective and the opportunity set in front of us, it allowed me to connect the dots in ways that led to that flavor of transaction as opposed to a more traditional outcome.
There's so much in that. There are two things that are particularly interesting. One is that it sounds like you were really focused on the exit strategy early in the life cycle. And I know that's something that you advocate for when you are working with companies like as an investor now. And so let's talk about that. And the other thing too that I think is so interesting is hearing you describe that orthogonal insight and those outcomes. I think that's also really powerful because one of the things that I find comes up often is this expectation of pattern matching, particularly in venture. I think it happens more often in venture. And it's so interesting because people want these outsized returns and you're looking for a really novel approach and a solution to a problem. And yet the pattern matching seems to really be in conflict with that. How did that focus on the exit drive your experience through that first company?
So much of building a new product into a new market, a new service, whatever it is about playing the game backwards, right? Oftentimes we start with an idea based on what we know about a market, but we really don't know how even the execution, the successful execution of that idea, service, whatever it is, will lead to some defined outcome. We are making a bunch of guesses. If you talk to the average founder, even today, certainly in 2014, it was the case, but even today, the idea, whatever they were working on, if you ask them like, where does this go? They're like, how do you get my money back? Right. A lot of them, well, Google's going to buy us or Amazon is going to buy us. One thing that you wind up growing up with in a place like Bridgeport, Connecticut, where there's just abject poverty around you and there's always people that want to harm you or hurt you or help you, you don't know, you got to make that determination, is a healthy sense of skepticism, right? And so I grew up with a constant like surveilling of what's going on around me. Do I believe it? Is it actually happening? Is what they're saying accurate or true? That level of skepticism is a thing that oftentimes will keep you not just away from like bad product ideas, but bad people too, bad hires, so to speak. And so I think that skepticism is something I take with me as almost like a tool into every evaluation or everything that I invest in, because those things oftentimes have not been met with that. When you start from that place and you begin to think about like these company exits and how people get to outcomes, like I like to validate all of those things. So if you tell me that Amazon in 2016 is going to buy you for X amount of dollars, how many exits, how many acquisitions did they do the prior year?
Right.
That's a very knowable thing, right? In the world where you've got to speculate and there's no answer, like a lot of times you've got to just make choices based on an uncertain future, right? Playing the game backwards allows you, especially with the amount of data that we have available to us today, either via 10Ks or annual reports, public information, social data, any of these wealths of knowledge, you can like start to piece together and validate whether or not our direction is, actually true or likely. And if you told me in 2016 that Amazon was going to buy you for $1 billion because you're going to be able to take over the world of marketing and e-commerce with the thing that you're doing, I might not believe you, right? Because in that year, Amazon spent maybe $106 million of total capital across 7 acquisitions. So the average acquisition was about 10 to 15 million bucks. So they're most likely not going to buy you for $1 billion. It's not the way they buy things. So I try to take that with me into every conversation, every investment decision. Now, again, there's a bias there, and it almost sets in some ways how investors look at it as it sets a ceiling on how to think about all of the possible angles and directions that a company can go. And that's certainly true, right? There is a confining sort of feature to thinking about, hey, if I start this company, where's my exit? Probably 100 million, 200 million to these kinds of companies. Maybe it's a $2 billion exit and you hadn't considered all these other possibilities. The reality is, though, that we're not yet at a place where Black and brown founders can think that big, that they have license to walk into a VC's office and just say, well, I'm going to generate a $2 billion outcome. And I don't know where it's going to come from. I just have this belief that I can get there. And to me, that's a very inspirational, founder kind of philosophy that is great to have. It's got to be backed up by some data and the hard work of like customer discovery and making sure you've got the right market and all the hard stuff. But we just haven't really unlocked that level of freedom, quite frankly, to think that big and to do that with other people's dollars. If I can help founders get there in a more assured way by helping them understand the lay of the land for M&A, IPO, like most founders say, I'm going to go public. To go public, you need 180 to $200 million of recurring revenue. You need a C-suite management team that's been there before and done that, right? Those are not easy things to accomplish in any company. That's part of the rationale for why I approach things like outside in and sometimes inside out.
You're right. The data on IPOs over the last 40 years is not in your favor as an entrepreneur. Better to assume M&A is your exit. And then what about on the orthogonal thinking? Were there any examples of that in any of your companies, or is there a company today?
There are some examples of companies that I've either invested in, advised, or supported in some way where the source of their growth in their mind was going to come from a very certain path that they were on.
Right.
And by pushing on how they thought about their market and what tools they were using to ferret out the direction they were going, it led to other explorations that then created the whole company, quite frankly. And I certainly have examples of that from my own beginnings. When we first started Fix, we were going to be the one-stop shop for all insurance claims support. And so we were going to manage your warranty, right? That was the first layer. Then we were going to show you various like insurance pricing on a sort of device or per incident basis, so you could make the best decision in terms of what insurance to purchase. And then once you had it, the warranty would be managed by us. And then once you had a claim, we would manage the claim for you. Within that claims management process, we would get your thing, whatever was broken, back to you faster within 4 hours. And so here's this panoply of services, right? And doing one thing in a startup is hard, right? Because it didn't exist before. And most people think, okay, I'm going to do 2 different things. I had 6, right? But most people think I'm going to do these 2 or 3 things. It's only going to be twice as hard or 3 times as hard. It's exponential. It's exponential because the thing didn't exist, number one. And what's required for a thing that didn't exist for you to be successful with that is for you to commit 100% of yourself to that. But if another thing that comes along is like now 3 or 4 times as hard, you can't expand yourself to go accommodate what's required of that, especially at those early stages. And so for us, we had these 5 or 6 things that we were doing. What we discovered in that process by applying a data layer to everything that we did was that customers only want this other thing. They only want us to repair, replace, fix their thing really fast. And so that's where we should focus all of our attention in the business. That ultimately led to a couple dozen service incidents a day, then ultimately a couple hundred. And now today, more than 3,000 per day, more than 30,000 per day, almost 2 million a year, over $500 million of new revenue growth.
a lot of founders or inventors, I think people underestimate how difficult behavior change is, how long it is. And again, the timeline of changing a customer's behavior is often not aligned with what a business wants. I don't think people think about that enough. It sounds like you were trying to work through some of that and then also responding to the market when it didn't go quite as you had expected. Yeah.
Totally. I mean, it was just all these other factors that founders just never get to think about.
No. Yeah.
But then they should, or have someone who can help them think through it.
Yes, absolutely. That's a great segue. Let's talk a little bit about your experience as an investor. I know you're not a huge fan of what I'll call classic VC. And I like that. There are obviously some great venture investors, but there are also some that maybe we could do things differently, is how I like to think about it. Tell us about your philosophy and what do you think some of the challenges are with a more traditional venture mindset?
Yeah, it feels some of the prep environments that I grew up in. One group of people has resources and sometimes can be discriminatory, or how do I say it? Maybe a little arrogant toward other members. I sense that pretty tremendously in the VC space. And understandably, VCs are oftentimes like very successful people academically and like in their careers before they were VCs. There's certainly a level of like pride and confidence in like what you did prior to becoming a VC that I think is a good thing, especially if you worked really hard to get yourself through Harvard or Syracuse or wherever you went to school. However, sometimes I think they forget that you're dealing with real people. And the reality is that even though an investor has $1 billion, in many ways can be seen as just a great source of investment, a good check writer, that's a human being, right? And they have a family, they care about things. They're making that decision in part because they care about maybe what you're doing, but they're also making that determination based on their own personal experiences and how they want to affect the world. And so I just try to tap into that as much as possible, particularly with founders, right? And I think a lot of times with VCs, because they are the allocators, there's a level of unnecessary scrutiny that happens. Now, if a thing is like inconsistent with your investment model, that makes total sense to me. But investing time to understand the context and the background of a founder and where they come from, I think is critical to understanding their thing also. And a lot of VCs are just not willing to invest that context. It's easier for them to just accept the world as a knowable set of sequenced outcomes that are going to happen based on some kind of mysterious pattern that they think is hard to penetrate. And I just don't think that way. I think that sometimes the most interesting things come from places that we don't expect it to. Look at how we get to the moon, like in this country. Yeah, the US was building this incredible military and financial resources in the 1950s and 60s. And we have these brilliant scientists and all these people that are highly capable, but we relied on this small group of Black women who would do the calculations, these hidden figures that ultimately went into the machine that powered us to the moon and made sure our trajectory was accurate, right? Like, no one would think that's where you're going to.
No one saw that coming.
No one saw that coming, right? And I think those kinds of things are happening every single day. My goal as an investor is to find those things that are happening, work with those founders to expose, illuminate what they're working on to a broader market, and make sure that they not only create value, they actually capture it.
I think you're really speaking to what I would call the inside view problem in VC and maybe in investment broadly. How is your approach to fund management different, or what do you aspire to do with that now that you're on the other side of the table as an investor?
What I tell founders all the time is innovate on the parts that need to be innovated on. Mm-hmm. And then everything else, try to build those things, replicating as much as what your customer expects to see. Right. And so the way I typically see this is a founder comes in, I got this new product for the enterprise. It's going to be great. They need it. We've also built a whole new pricing model for how the enterprise is going to consume it. It's based on a SaaS plus a platform fee plus services to drive immediate ROI to the customer. That sounds great. But now when you meet that CIO, when you meet that director of technology within the company that you're selling to, and you tell them, hey, accept this new product for this new way that you've got to do things that's going to help you, but also accept this new pricing model. The customers almost, by and large, always say no, because it's forcing them to agree to things that are unlike anything else that they've bought and require them to do things that are non-natural within the company, right? And so I see the fund management business as the same, right? I'm innovating on the apertures that allow me to take a differentiated view in terms of what I expect to happen in this market, a market that to me speaks more to strong financial performance that leads to more structured M&A versus these long tail 10, 15-year outcomes that are more common in VC, is a more common viewpoint in VC. But the parts that relate to actually how I manage the fund, because they're not germane to an M&A driven philosophy around my investing style, I manage the fund using all the same traditional tools and methodologies and workflows as everybody else. And so FinStrat Management is actually my fund management accounting team that manages all aspects of my fund. And all of it is just like very standard rote stuff. We meet weekly to talk about expenses and ROI and other things that we're measuring week to week, day to day, et cetera. All my investor communications, like they go out quarterly. We use a service that helps you understand how much of the fund you own and where your capital accounts are being managed. And so I just take a viewpoint that innovate on the parts that require a different viewpoint to disrupt the market and take some of the old stuff with you so your customers don't get altitude sickness.
Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. There's no need to try to reinvent gravity when physics has actually solved that problem pretty well for us. Totally
Right.
get that. I was curious more as to, are you targeting different LPs, for example? Or is it a different, obviously every fund has a deal thesis and people that are hopefully like-minded supporting it. Is there a different perspective with maybe a more traditional set of LPs? Those are two things I was curious about.
So on the first question, in terms of LPs, absolutely. I think my model allows for that, right? Like I think a more traditional VC model means that you're talking to conventional allocators like pension funds, et cetera, or fund of funds that have 6-month, 2-year, 5-year process. And yes, I think that would be great if that was a pathway that was available to me. The reality is it's just not a pathway available to most Black and brown emerging managers. There's a ton of emerging manager programs. A lot of them have stiff requirements that almost make it unfeasible for you to even apply. I've had to take a non-traditional approach to raising capital. Now I've got some traditional sort of features as well, with State of North Carolina, Bank of America being my anchor investors. In terms of everyone else, I've been able to go to PE firms that have separate allocations. I've been able to go to folks that run hedge funds that are looking for visibility into growth opportunities for future companies that they might want to invest in, or strategics that I've developed relationships with that are interested in partnerships and channel relationships and also strategic outcomes. And so those are beachheads that have helped me solidify my corner of the LP market in a way that I think other VCs just can't, by nature of the conventionality which they're embracing.
The other one is, one of the things about venture that is both its strength and weakness is the desire for a minimum 10x return, right? It is wonderful for everyone when it works out well. And it also drives a lot of what I would call pretty poor outcomes. It just feels like a lot of wasted effort. I've always wondered why we don't have a 6 to 7x or whatever. Are those some areas in which you're thinking more expansively? How are you thinking about that?
I think my thinking on that is evolving, right? It continues to develop. I don't know that I have one singular answer or philosophy relative to that, because I am a capitalist. I do believe in the power of economic consequence and its ability to dictate mobility in your life and allow you to spread that to other people. But it does take a level of wealth and wealth creation for that to happen. And so I do believe in that. And I also believe in pursuing outcomes that give you the best opportunity to maximize those outcomes. Is that 10x? I don't know. Is that 7x, 6x? Maybe, right? I can tell you this definitively: the best firms, the top 10%, top 25%, let's say 4x, 5x returns. So it's not earth shattering, right? The top decile firms are obviously significantly more than that. But like the overwhelming majority of funds and investors do not have even 5x returns, right? Regardless of what you believe, whether you believe that, you should chase 10x outcomes because you're venture and that's what your investors expect, or hey, we should be more calibrated toward 2x or 3x realistic outcomes so that investors have a realistic sense of where I'm going to land. Regardless of your philosophy, I think it's just imperative that you are direct and open with your investors, in a way that like speaks to the truth that you believe. And also like that helps them arrive at a conclusion based on what you're telling them that is consistent with like reality. Right. And so here's what I sort of rail against with founders and also investors is just because you have an investor who is ready to write you a $10 million check for your fund, they want to believe, or they want you to tell them that there's a possibility for a 10x return, 20x return, and you don't believe, that's inconsistent with your values. Right. So regardless of the thing that we're talking about, like align yourself with investors, founders, et cetera, that are consistent with like your world philosophy and how you think about your own value, your personal values. Right. And so if those are not aligned, you shouldn't say that. You shouldn't pursue that outcome. Right. And so that's typically the way I think of it. I think the other way I think of it is also like what's going on in the macro market, right? What's happening in the larger market around economic cycles, M&A, future investment, et cetera. And a lot of times investors are not even like thinking about those things. And so if you're amidst one of those cycles, I think it's completely reasonable, especially in today's world where almost half of the capital that's being deployed for venture is being deployed into busted deals, right? So think about that. We've deployed less capital, and then even the capital that's deployed, more of it is going toward old busted deals as opposed to new deals. So the number is shrinking, right? I think those are good reasons to go to investors and say, hey, I don't know that 10x outcomes are reality. I think we're probably closer to wherever we are. And so I think do whatever feels right for you, but benchmark that against what's actually happening in the real world and what's actually happening in the markets that you care about.
I think that's really interesting. I wanted to go back to something we alluded to earlier. Given your background as an M&A lawyer, and again, your very astute decision as a founder to prioritize an exit, at least as a North Star, I think that seems to have been successful for you. You mentioned that you bring that into how you're actually operating the fund and even how you're raising from investors. Will you tell us more about that? Because I think that is also super interesting.
I think our model allows for a broader sort of application and thinking of these macro factors like M&A, IPO, et cetera, and how they affect our investment thesis. So it absolutely allows for that. And so that's a good thing. In terms of operational application and how I essentially operationalize that into the fund, it guides my investment decisions. Like how I invest, there's a whole list of things that are very common. And I would say 99% of what other investors look at are the same things that I look at. Right. I care about the health of the business, gross margin analysis, how much market share they have, what their TAM is, how many renewal cycles have they been through with customers, like all the same things that other investors think about. But I think my edge is really the ability to go then talk to the right sets of people to better understand how they're thinking about the future consolidation, acquisition, investability of a company. Right. And if you could speak to the folks that actually consummate deals, right? The bankers, the corp dev professionals at the Fortune 1000s, the other kinds of investment professionals that look to do large scale buyouts once a company has gone public or gone further than the Series A, Series B investors. If you can incorporate their perspective into the investment decision, I think you can make your investment that much stronger. I've operationalized it by not only inculcating that perspective into my investment decisions, but, also like developing a whole M&A playbook that then allows me to help that founder operationalize M&A within their own company. Because M&A is not just one way, it's multi-headed, right? When I walk into a founder conversation after I've made an investment and give them my M&A playbook, there are not just plays in there that help them think about how to build repeatability in the sales system so that we're selling a thing that has independent value, asset value from the founding team and everybody else. But also like, how do we think about, okay, we're now headed to Series B. We've got some cash. We want to keep going. We're not sure where the market is, but let's do an acquisition that's going to now bring us faster acceleration to revenue or a new capability that unlocks 40% new revenue from our existing customer base. Right. Those are the kinds of ways that you can defensively, offensively use M&A to achieve outcomes and goals. And those are just like some of the ways that I operationalize it Other ways, some of my investors, one of my investors is a very well-known acquisition firm that has billions and billions of dollars under management, and they acquire companies, right? And I can give them early understanding of what's moving through the pipeline and where it could land. And that feedback I get from them also helps me guide and validate or invalidate whatever it is that founder thinks is going to happen. I think operationalizing it that way allows me to help those founders in ways that they simply can't help themselves.
I love that. I think that's super valuable. Just the fact that you were actually educating and helping founders think through this process, because I'm sure for a lot of folks, they've never been through it before. And there's all kinds of things you wouldn't know if you haven't, gone through M&A several times. I think that's a huge value add. Luke, this has been such a great conversation, as I knew it would be. Is there anything else that you wanted to talk about before we get to our last question?
Yeah. What are you hearing in the market? What are some of the concerns that you hear both from investors and founders in the market today?
Oh man, so many. I think one big thing is the last 18 months, almost 2 years have been so different from the years that came before. It sounds obvious, we came out of COVID, et cetera, but I think people are still really struggling as to how to work through that. I think that's all the way from a tiny founder up through investors, through the largest companies in the world. I think that we're just in this holding pattern, particularly in the United States. I think globally too. Undoubtedly, our election has something to do with that. It's a strange time to be wondering what comes next. I don't know how people felt when they lived through inflection points other times in history, but it certainly feels like that right now.
100%. Yeah, 100%. We're definitely in this evolution that's happening in real time, and it's compressing a lot of things that we in the past have just taken for granted. One of the more promising things is like cash is king, and like growth to me is a thing that it can be objectively positive regardless of what it is you're doing or what the market looks like. And so the financial performance of these companies is way more important nowadays than it ever was. I hope that perspective leads us to is an understanding of how Black and brown businesses are almost better suited for that world, right? Because if you're a Black or brown founder, you don't have license always to go chase some idea or some new project that has a very uncertain payback on it. You've got to get to healthy margins and real revenue. Most likely you're the first woman to do this in your family. And everyone's upset that you didn't become a doctor, and you've got to go prove it very quickly.
Pragmatism is definitely the word of the day, right? I think, in a lot of families. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you need both, right? You need people who are crazy, they're visionary, and they believe things that are so far from the reality that we have today. You need those people, but you need a level of pragmatism as well. I tell founders all the time, it's thinking big, but acting small.
And this is full circle, I think, on this conversation, but I think it's the power of diverse perspectives too. And I know diversity and inclusion are getting a really bad rap today, but I'm so passionate about it because it's not just that we look different, it's that we have different experiences, different contexts. You are a perfect example of someone who has had a context that is unusual in an investment setting or an entrepreneurship setting, right? And you inherently are going to look at something a little bit differently than someone who's had a more traditional path, perhaps. And there's such value in that. And it's very different. It's an intangible. And all of our businesses today are effectively based on intangibles. So if that's not valuable, I don't know what we're doing here. So.
No, that's exactly right. That's exactly right.
So here's our last question, then we'll let you go. Just given that breadth of experience and perspective that you have, I always want to know what people think about high performance companies. So the question is, what do you think that high performance firms do differently from average performers?
They care about culture first. And they care about culture in the context of what they're doing and how that impacts the culture, right? Founders who are highest performing are coachable, right? They understand that they might be the domain expert as it relates to that particular product or service or whatever they're doing, but they're always curious, questioning, and skeptical about where they could take it, whether they're taking it in the right direction. And they're unafraid to ask those questions. Top performing companies occupy a very special place in the mind of their customers. If you ask their customers about them, if you talk to 7 of their customers, you're going to hear 7 very close value propositions. And no one's going to say, we love them because they do A. And then someone says, oh, we love them because they do B. And then we love them because they're all going to be similar. And so I think the highest performing companies have that kind of consistency. across their value propositions, super coachable, and like they index on culture.
That is a great answer. Thank you so much, Luke. We really appreciated having you here today.
Thank you, Neeta. Thank you. This is great.
Thanks so much for listening to Good Revenue. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe to the show, give us a rating, or leave us a review. It helps other listeners find us, and we really appreciate your support. You can also catch full videos and highlights on our YouTube channel.